In this video, we want to finally do some volume blending to where we can fade in different layers, we can fade in an entire song, and we want to animate a volume over time. So just as a reminder, hit play, click down here, hit the play button, it's cue. It'll create our music manager. And what we want to do is we want to animate the volume up and down on each of our different audio sources down here. So if we increase the layer, we want to animate that one up. And we may set them down to 0 by default. I don't know yet, but we want to build a system to where we can animate the volume over time given a fade duration and a target volume. So let's do that. The animation is primarily going to exist within our music player script because we want each music player to be responsible for managing the different layers associated with that particular song. For example, we may have two different songs. One song may, have a different layer type than another, but we want to still be able to blend in a combined total music song into another combined song. So first of all, we need to just control some simple animations with the various layers, and then we'll worry about blending between multiple music players a little later. To do this, we're saying that we want to play the song, setting up the clip, we're telling it to play, but now we need to actually fade up the volume. Technically start at 0 volume and then animate it up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to additionally add this place where we are creating each of our different audio sources. For each audio source, when it gets created, I want to set the volume to 0. And then when we're ready, we will fade up the volume from 0. So we're going to create a method to do this, and we're going to call this pretty simply public void. If I just type in fade, we don't necessarily know if we want to fade up or down. Let's be really explicit and just say fade volume. And let's think about the things we need in order to fade the volume. Well, I think I need a duration, right? So we'll say fade time. And we also may want a target, and maybe that we'll put that out front. Float target volume. Because we don't necessarily know if we want to fade this up or down, we just want to fade the volume. We could give it the target of 0, and that could fade from its current volume down to 0, or we could give it 1, or we could give it whatever the music manager says the volume will be. Like that will probably be the proper way to do it. So let's actually do that. Let's say once we begin playing a track and we set up all of our audio sources, we want to automatically have this fade up the volume because that is part of playing a thing, right? Like we want to play it, but in most cases when we play a song, we also want to hear it too, right? I could type in volume. This doesn't exist yet, right? However, we do have our fade time. So I'll pass that in at least. So here's the question. Do we want each music player to track its own volume, or do we want the volume to only exist on the music manager? Now, I would argue that I think because multiple songs, it would make sense to have multiple songs at different volumes. Generally, if you're looking to turn down the volume of the music, you're wanting to turn down all music simultaneously. So to me, it makes more sense to put this on the music manager than it does to put this on each instance of each music player. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come to my music manager and we're going to make, so what we could do here is we could make a public variable called volume and we could assign it, but I'm actually going to go one step deeper than that because I don't ever want the volume to go above 1, right? Like I don't want anything to be able to set the volume to 3, for example, because if we look at our audio sources, an audio source can only go up to 1 as the max volume. It can go between 0 and 1. Beyond that, we don't really know what's going to happen inside of the audio source. So what we really want to do is we want to clamp the volume between 0 and 1, no matter what. And one way you can do that is to use properties. What I could do, for example, is I could say float, will contain underscore convention, volume is equal to, default it to 1. Nothing else can see this, right? Our music player has no idea what the volume is. We can't really pass it music manager.volume because it's private. But what we can do is we can specify a public float volume that returns the volume of volume. Well, the value of volume. Value of volume is kind of hard to say. So our fade volume, what we really want is our music manager.volume, right? And we're exposing that out so we can see it. So technically we could say music manager.instance.volume if we want. I'm debating if I want to make this a private variable or not. We'll keep it here for now. This allows us to see the volume, not to directly access it. Now, because we actually may want to access the volume, or we may want to drive the volume from, say, a UI manager or some kind of slider or something later on, I'm actually going to change this. I'm going to say, you know what? I'm totally fine with something seeing the volume, so get return whatever the value of volume is. So this is fine. For now, I'm going to keep this private. I still want to do some kind of check here because technically our music manager can still set our volume to be 3 or something, right? We never want that to be the case. So we always want to ensure that our volume is between 0 and 1. Now, one thing we can do here is we can validate our value of volume by using this public property here. So if we access the property, we can return the current value of volume, or we can allow Music Manager to set a new volume. However, if it does, it needs to be between 0 and 1. So what we can do is we can say, whatever value you tried to replace volume with, we're going to clamp, .f.clamp, value between 0 and max 1. So we're going to make sure that if you try to pass on a new value into volume, that it is never outside of 0 and 1. This is a super handy shortcut for validating new values into variables. And then lastly, we actually need to set our private one with this new value that we've clamped. So this is how you can validate a new value for a variable. All this together is just saying, allow anything to see it publicly, and privately allow us to change it as long as it's between 0 and 1. Or if it is outside of 0 and 1, it will clamp it up to those values, or down to 1 or up to 0. As long as we actually do it through the volume. Technically, we could go through _volume and we could reassign it to whatever we want, but this is just one step closer to protecting ourselves. Long-winded side tracking here, but fade volume, we just want to pull the current value of musicmanager.instance.volume and pass that into here. So our fade volume will receive our music manager volume, whatever that is, and we want to animate AudioSource.volume over time for each one. Each AudioSource.volume over time. Okay, now let's actually start animating the volume. To do this, we're going to use coroutines. There are a few different ways you can animate things, but personally, what I like to do is just use a coroutine, track elapsed time, make a small change, yield to the next frame, increase a change, yield to the next frame, increase a change, yield to the next frame. And then we can animate most things through code very simply by using that structure. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. The first thing we need to do is we need to validate our data. So we can take in technically any target volume at this point. Like we could pass it this volume that we know will be clamped, but we don't necessarily know that other random values will be clamped. So let's just do that just in case. So first of all, we're going to take our target volume and we are going to clamp it. Just like we did before, we'll just say target volume between 0 and 1. We just know that audio sources will never go outside of 0 and 1. We'll do the same thing with our fade time, but technically we don't really want to max fade time. Like we could define one arbitrarily if we want to, but if the designer puts in 100 seconds as a fade time, like that's kind of on them. Like I don't want to put arbitrary constraints on that, but we do know that a negative fade time might break our code. So let's actually make sure that we don't get a negative fade time. So easiest way to do that is we could say if fade time is less than 0, then fade time equals 0. Now, technically you could put this into 2 separate lines if you want. Like you could do something like that. You could put it in brackets. You know, for validation stuff, I just like that to keep that as simple and out of the way as possible. Your mileage may vary. You could, put it in brackets and then put a warning or something if you want. Most times when I use coroutines, I like to store a coroutine in a variable or a field. And the reason is because I want full control over being able to stop and restart that coroutine if I want. I don't necessarily want just random fired off coroutines just starting and stopping whenever they want, because that could mess up my code. There are situations where that would be perfectly fine, but in this case, I want to animate my volume, and I want to make sure that I don't have two different things trying to animate my volume in different ways, and that would conflict. A pattern that I like to use at the top is I'm going to create a field or variable of type coroutine, and I'll call this fade volume routine. You could set this to null if you want, doesn't really matter. But this right here, whenever we start a new coroutine, I'm going to store it inside of our coroutine and then use it to start and stop a new IEnumerator. If we already have one going, we want to kill it and start a new one. So if we already have a coroutine, like we're already animating something, we don't want two things to be animating the same value at the same time. That gives you inconsistent results. So we'll just say stop the current animation. So we'll say stop coroutine, fade volume routine. Our coroutine animation is going to be different depending on if we have our additive layer or our single layer. Now remember our layer types of here. Additive is if we want to fade in each layer individually and stack them, versus single as if we want to activate one layer, blend that out, blend up another layer, blend that out, blend up another layer, and so forth. It'll be a little bit different depending. So I'm going to start off with one. I'm going to call this animate. We'll do additive first. I think that's fine. Additive layer. To do that, like once we've stopped our current coroutine, we need to start a new coroutine animation for this additive layer in this case. So first of all, in order to even get here, we need to detect which layer type it is, because if it's additive layer, we want to do the additive lerp. If it's single layer, or unique or whatever you called it, we want to do a single layer lerping animation. In order to determine this, we need access to the current music event. And currently I'm not accessing that anywhere. Now, we could receive a parameter of type music event, and we could receive that and then take that in. But that would be kind of cumbersome because each music player should only be handling one music event at a time. So really what I want to do is I want to define a current music event for each music player and just hold on to that and assign that whenever we play a new music event, right? We're passing it in here. Let's hold on to it and then use that for our blending. So right here, when we say music event right there, let's actually hold on to it before we set up our layer sources, and let's create at the top a type of music event. Just call that music event, but you could call it current music event if you want. Assign it to null. You don't have to be explicit with your assignments or your default assignments. I like to be able to see that while I'm coding, just to help visually troubleshoot things. So right here, whenever we play a new music event, let's just hold on to it. So we'll say music event is equal to the one that we receive. So now anytime we pull from music event, we're pulling from the last one that we received when we called play. So when something else calls play and gives us a music event, we'll hold on to that, we'll store it, and then now we'll just pull from that. So what we want to do is we want to say the music event that we've been holding on to from our play function, we want to test if our music event dot layer type is equal to additive, right? Layer type dot additive. And if it is, I want to start additive blend animation. Otherwise, else if music event dot layer type equal to layer type dot single start single blend animation. So we've stopped our current coroutine if it was already going, and we want to start a new one. So we'll just say we want to start coroutine. We actually don't have one yet. So before we do this, we'll come down here, IEnumerator, because we want to be able to start and stop this thing over time. And we'll actually be more specific when we name this. Because we're going to be using lerping from 0 to 1 value, like over time, we'll be very specific with this. We'll call it Lerp source additive. And then I also like to add routine on the end just to communicate my intent on how I'm using this. So this right here, I'm going to copy paste that. We'll do open close, just like that. The reason you're getting an error here is because we're not returning anything. If you want to get rid of it, you'll return null, but we'll remove that in a second. Start coroutine lerp source additive routine. Lerp source additive routine. We'll also do, we'll set this up, why not? Lerp source single routine. Build return null. And we'll just put this here. So I kind of like to define the structure of things before I start filling it out. So now we have our Lerp source additive routine. Again, you may want to think about what you need in order to perform the function. We still need a target volume and a fade time because we're going to animate over the fade time, and we need a point to animate to. So we're going to pass in both those things, just pretty simply, just pass them on through like we've been doing. Target volume and fade time. You need to define the starting point of all of your layers before you start animating, because you want a starting point for each layer individually, because you may be halfway through animating up one layer, start another fade, and you don't want that one to start at 1, right? Like you don't want to hard set these at 1 or 0. You want to start the new animation at its current value and then animate up. Save all of the current volumes of all of your layers at the start of a new animation. So this is going to seem kind of weird, but that's why we're doing it. So what that's going to look like is very simply, we want a list of values that aligns with our list of sources. Now, technically, to be more proper about this, we could define our own little like audio layer or something in its own class, and then that class could handle what the source is and the volume and pair those together in a single object. We could do that, but again, I'm keeping it simple for now, and we'll refactor later once we have our entire system defined, because we don't even know like what our final results will be yet. So we want to get our layers kind of set and then refactor later if we need to. But for now, I'm okay with doing this. We'll just say list. Remember, our volumes are floats. So we'll say list float. Be very explicit about what this is. Again, spacer. Okay, so this is just a list that we're going to pull to align with our layer source volume. So basically, if we have 3 layers, 1, 2, 3, and it's 1 volume, 0 volume, we're going to clear and then save all the current values inside of a separate list that we can use for our animation. So then that would be like 1, 1, 0, and we'll just do that. So specifically to do that, all we have to do, source start volumes. First, we'll clear our list. Whatever it was before, we're starting a new animation, so let's clear them and then save them at their current state, because what if we trigger multiple fade volumes? We want them to continually reset and animate from their current position and not jump around too much. So I'll press tab. The number of times we want to run this is just once for each layer, so we'll do layer sources.count. Okie dokie. And then for each one, we just want to add it. So source start volumes dot add. Then we'll go into our current index for each layer, store the volume. So we're just adding the current value of volume from each layer. Like first audio source, store the volume. Second audio source, store the volume. Third audio source, store the volume. And we're storing all of those inside of a list of values. The other thing is I actually will want to do this again for our lerping for our single routine as well. I just know in advance that I'm going to want to reuse this, and it's kind of self-contained. I'm going to highlight those, quick action, enter, and call this save source start volumes. This is just preemptive to allow us to define a new starting point each time we call fade volume so that we prevent some like jumping around, like if we call fade volume multiple times in a row. So it'll smooth it out a bit. First thing I'm going to get rid of yield return null. We'll yield in a second. For those of you who haven't used lerping before, it's you have a start value and an end value, and you want to incrementally move between those two values based on a 0 to 1 ratio. So 0 will be the start value, 1 will be the end value, 0.5 will be the value in between those, 0.25 will be the value a quarter of the way. So if we can animate between 0 and 1, then we can get the value between the start and end. And so if we have a start value as our current volume and our end value as our target volume, we can lerp between those. For our start volume, we're just going to initialize this. Float. We're going to calculate a new volume each frame, and then we'll figure out what that is, and then we'll set that volume. Our start volume is going to be our starting point, and that's just going to change depending on each layer. So you could actually redefine these in the loop as well, but I know that I'm going to reuse these and swap out the values. I'm just going to put them at the top. You could actually do this with a while loop as well. Either is fine. I don't know. I've always used for loops for it. We'll say elapsed time starting at 0. So our elapsed time starts at 0. We want to continue to run this loop as long as elapsed time is less than or equal to our fade time, right? So start at 0, count time until we hit our fade time. And that, if this is 2.5 seconds, then start at 0, count 2.5 seconds, and then stop running the loop. But that only works if our elapsed time, each time we run the loop, we increment by time.delta time. So this is essentially saying run the for loop as long as elapsed time is less than or equal to fade time, and increment the for loop over time. This is what that is doing. And then for each cycle, we want to go through each layer and adjust volume this frame. So at this point, we need to go through each layer, right? Like we need to cycle through all 3 simultaneously. So we'll say for, again, so this entire larger loop is going to happen over time, but each cycle, we want to go through all of our audio sources layers on this music player. So we'll say, again, audio, what do we call this? Layer sources count. For each layer source that we have, we want to adjust the volume. Adjust volume. So we'll say this audio source's start volume is, so this one is whatever we saved inside of our source start volumes. Because remember, we did that up top. Remember, we saved a new one when we started this new animation. So we'll access that at the current index, store that value. So layer 1's source start volume is whatever layer 1's started at, since we saved it. The new volume that we want to adjust for this frame is the lerp between our start volume, right? Like our starting point, our ending point, so our target volume, and we want a ratio of 0 to 1, and the easiest way to get that is it's just a math thing. If we say elapsed time divided by total time will give us a ratio. So in other words, 0 divided by 2.5, if 2.5 was our fade time, would be 0. So that's the first time. If our elapsed time is, let's say our fade time is 2 seconds. If our elapsed time is 1 second, then this will be 0.5. If our fade time and our elapsed time are both 2, so 2 fade time and our elapsed time is now 2, it'll be 1. So we should always get a value between 0 and 1. So mathf lerp start end 0 to 1. This will give us the value between these according to this 0 to 1 ratio. New volume. And then finally, we've calculated our new volume. We need to actually set it. So layer sources, since we're going through each layer one at a time, this index, layer sources, volume is equal to this new volume that we just calculated. Now, at this point, we're actually baiting up all the volumes, not to a specific layer. So I'm just going to leave a note for myself here and say only fade up to predefined layer. So for example, if I minimize this, go to my side, we can define the active layer as being 2, we only want to fade up to there. We don't want to fade all 3 of the volumes there. So I'm just putting a note here that eventually, right here, I only want to fade up to, if we're only on layer 2, fade up to there, but don't fade up layer 3. So we'll put that in later, but for now, this should work. And for each cycle, right, like each run through, so all of our audio sources, we've gone through all of them, we've hit the end of the frame, we want to yield to the next frame. And the reason we're getting an error here is because we need to pass in the target volume and our fade time. Just pass it along right here. Target volume, fade time. This one. Oh, this is a copy paste, so we're actually going to change this to Lerp source single. All right, we'll do that one later. Let's just test out our source additive routine and see if this is blending. So just as a quick reminder, what we're doing is when we fade the volume, we're receiving a target volume and a fade time. We are restarting the coroutine, our animation, if it was already going. We are determining if we need to do the additive animation or the single animation. For now, we're focused on the single. We'll, again, put a to-do here. Complete single coroutine later. And then in our additive, we are saving our starting point volumes so that we have each layer independently has its own starting point. If I highlight those, you can see these are going to change for each separate layer. So I'm just defining them up top and changing them. You could define a new one in here and for, it doesn't really matter. It's just preference thing. Right here, we're creating a loop that will run over a set amount of time. That's what this is doing up here. Run over elapsed time until fade time. And then while we're inside of here, each frame, we will go through each audio source for the layers. So each audio source, we will redefine what the start point is for that layer. We will calculate a new volume between the start and the end. We know what the end is because that's our target. And we will give it a 0 to 1 value based on its current part in the animation, based on the amount of elapsed time. And then finally, we will actually set that new volume inside of the layer sources volume. And then right here, we'll just say, wait until the next update tick, essentially, or the next time we come back around. And then we will animate it a little bit more. We'll get a little bit further in our elapsed time, wait, a little bit further in our elapsed time, wait, and then we'll go through it. I think this will work, but let's actually test it out and troubleshoot if it doesn't. All right, any errors? No. General console, snap that over here because I'm sure we'll need it later. I'm gonna hit play. Cool, we actually heard a fade. That is what we want. So I think this is probably a lot to digest in one tutorial. So in a future tutorial, we'll finish out the single one and do like a stop, fade out, and all this other stuff. But for now, you can see how we can start to blend in our music player, even though we have multiple layers at a time, because you could set up the same thing to just do this animation over time on a single audio source, but with our system, we want individual control over the layers. So again, if I pause it here, you can see, you can actually watch that animate if I unpause it. Right? And you can actually see that it's not getting all the way to 1. So, we'll fix that later, but we're getting pretty close and we just need to continue defining our IEnumerator and add additional support for another layer type. So thanks for hanging in there. This is kind of a brutal one, especially if you haven't used coroutines before, but this is kind of the really meaty guts of our blending system. So once we get this done, we'll be able to polish it and refine it and just clarify it a little bit more. So.